afternoon and welcome to our webinar. Apologies, there appears to have been an audio problem up till now, so we will start again. Our webinar today is Partitioned Survival, a superior choice to the Markov model in oncology. Partitioned survival analysis is currently the most commonly used modelling approach within health technology assessment for advanced or metastatic cancers. However, until recently, there was no formal documentation of partition survival analysis and its pros and cons. The NICE Decision Support Unit have recently published a technical support document which critically reviews the use of partition survival analysis in decision modelling in healthcare. This webinar provides a summary of the new DSU document, including a description of partition survival analysis versus Markov models, recent use in health technology assessment, strengths, limitations, and recommendations. The information may help to understand approaches taken by others, inform choice of model type, provide credible justification to increase chances of NICE and evidence review group accepting the approach taken, show that limitations have been considered and addressed where possible, and be able to effectively respond to queries from HTA agencies. The webinar will be led by Hannah Gillis, a consultant health economist at MTech Access. Hannah has over 5 years' experience working in market access, designing and developing Markov models, discrete event simulations and partition survival models across a wide range of disease areas, including oncology, MS, HIV, psoriasis, and medical technologies. She has developed global models as well as working on numerous health technology assessments across the UK and the Nordics. Hannah is experienced in all stages of the modelling process, from initial research, scoping and technical model development, through to documentation, training and post-HTA submission support. Before we begin the webinar, please note that your lines will be muted throughout the presentation, but we encourage you to submit questions via the questions facility on the panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And I will now pass over to Hannah.
Hello, my name's Hannah and thank you for joining this webinar today. I will be talking about partition survival models and this presentation is mainly based on the NICE DSU technical support document which was published last year. So firstly, to set the scene, imagine you have a new oncology product coming to market and you require a cost-effectiveness model. You know that partition survival analysis has been used frequently in oncology, and it's a straightforward way to apply your overall survival and progression-free survival data directly from your clinical trial. However, you should always consider all model options when you're choosing an approach to take, and you should also consider the potential limitations. But until now, there was no formal documentation of partition survival analysis and its pros and cons. So this is where the DSU document comes in. So how will the information in the new DSU document be useful? So it might help you to understand approaches that have been taken by others previously, help inform your choice of model type, help provide credible justification of your model type so that there's a higher chance of NICE or ERG accepting your approach. And this obviously applies to other health technology assessment bodies across the world as well. It will help you show that you've considered the limitations and attempted to address these where possible, and be able to effectively respond to any queries you might get from the HTA agencies. So overall, it's about helping you to be as prepared as you can. So the DSU document was titled Partition Survival Analysis for Decision Modelling in Healthcare, a Critical Review, and it was published in June last year. Partition survival analysis has already been extensively used in NICE technology appraisals, and it's actually the most commonly used modelling approach for interventions treating advanced or metastatic cancers. But the objective of this document was to provide a clear description and critique of partition survival analysis to inform policy decisions relating to cost effectiveness. So here on the right-hand side, you can see the key sections of the DSU document, and we will also use these topics as the basis for our presentation presentation today as well. So first of all, we will give a description of partition survival analysis and compare it to Markov models, describing the structural assumptions and data requirements. The DSU also did a review of the use of partition survival in recent NICE technology appraisals as well, so we will discuss that. The critique of the partition survival analysis, so this is focusing on its pros and cons versus Markov models. And finally, recommendations for selecting your model approach, documentation, and recommendations for future research as well. So to start with, I will start by explaining what is a partition survival model and how it compares to a conventional Markov model. So here you can see a standard three-state Markov model, which is a very common approach for oncology models. The three health states here are progression-free, progressed disease, and death. And the arrows represent where patients can move from one health state to another. Now, in a Markov model, the way in which this movement is determined is by transition probabilities, and the state membership is determined using matrices of transition probabilities. And these determine the probability that an individual will transition from one health state to another in a given time period. So in a partition survival analysis, the key difference is the way in which the movement between the health states is defined. So we can apply a partition survival analysis to this same three health state structure, but the way in which the movement is determined are by survival curves. So the state membership is derived from non-mutually exclusive survival curves. Quite often you will have overall survival and progression-free survival curves from a clinical trial, which you can apply directly to this approach. So the top curve that you can see here is the overall survival, and all the patients below this curve are those who are still alive, and this is then partitioned into those who are progression-free and those who have progressed. And this is determined by the progression-free survival curve, which is the lower curve here on the diagram. So this means that the progressed disease state in the middle is calculated by taking the overall survival curve and subtracting the progression-free survival curve. So some additional properties of a partition survival analysis are that you can extend it to as many states as you wish, so it doesn't have to be just that three-state model, but there is the caveat that patients cannot move backwards through the health states. So for example, they can't move from being progressed to being progression-free. The data to inform survival curves usually comes from your clinical trials, but you can also use an NMA to perform analysis against comparators for which you don't have direct head-to-head data. And one of the key aspects of a partition survival analysis is that you need to extrapolate beyond the trial follow-up. And you'll see why this is important later in the presentation, but I will just cover a few of the methods, not in detail, but just to give you an overview. So common methods for the extrapolation include non-parametric approaches, so this would be to use Kaplan-Meier data directly from your trial. Parametric models, and there are 6 standard distributions that you would use for this, which are exponential, Weibull, log logistic, log normal, generalized gamma, and Gompertz. And then more complex approaches are things like flexible parametric models or mixture models, which are used less commonly but also often considered as options. So what are the key differences between partition survival model and a Markov model then? So firstly, as we've already mentioned, is that the state membership is derived from survival curves, whereas in a Markov model they're determined by transition probability. Secondly, the differences in state membership between treatments are determined by their survival curves. So because you would use, for example, an overall survival curve for your treatment of interest and an overall survival curve for your comparator, this data would be directly put into your model, and the difference between the treatments would be inherent. Whereas in a Markov model, the difference between treatments would depend on the treatment effect that you apply onto the transition probabilities, and also the structural relationship between the events. Thirdly, this is to do with the data that you require. So for a partition survival analysis, you would require PFS and OS curves for each treatment. Whereas for a Markov model, you would require time to event data on the transition probabilities and estimates of treatment effect on each transition probability as well. This can be quite important because in clinical studies, they typically report progression-free survival and overall survival, particularly in oncology. And it's not straightforward to derive time to event data required for a Markov model from these. It can be done, but it's just more straightforward if you could use a partition survival analysis and apply your PFS and OS data directly. So the next point is a key difference, which is that in a partition survival analysis, the PFS and OS are modelled independently, whereas in a Markov model, the clinical events are explicitly related. So in a Markov model, the overall survival depends on all three individual transition probabilities, and therefore the rate of death would reflect the proportion of patients in the progressed state and the differences in mortality between progression-free and progressed patients. So in partition survival analysis, this is not the case because the curves are assumed to be independent. So you would expect that for the clinical trial period, a partition survival analysis and a Markov model would give you similar results, but once you extrapolate that to longer time horizons, you would expect there to be differences in the two. This next point we've already mentioned as well, that you can't move backwards through the health states, whereas in a Markov model you have full flexibility to represent any transitions that you wish. And lastly, but not least, as this is a very important point, that in partition survival analysis, you're directly taking into account the time dependency, because by applying the OS and PFS curves, the risk changes over time. Whereas in a Markov model, you use transition probabilities that are constant over time, and if you wanted to take into account time dependency, you may need to use tunnel state or semi-Markov models. So next, let's look at how partition survival analysis has been used in NICE submissions. So the DSU document looked at the 30 most recent NICE technology appraisals of cancer treatments, and these were from May 2013 to February 2016. They looked at the company submissions, the assessment reports by the academic groups, and also the final appraisal determination documents. They extracted the model types used along with the justifications and the descriptions, along with the methods and criticisms from the academic groups as well. So the full results can obviously be seen in the report, but we've just got some of the key findings here. So out of the 30, 22 used a partition survival analysis, so that's 73%. 6 of these provided full justification for their choice of model approach, whereas the other 16 just gave precedent as their justification. 12 of them correctly described their approach as a partition survival analysis, whereas the other 10 had used different terminology, so they either described it as a Markov model or a semi-Markov model. And we will see later that this is one of the recommendations because there was a lot of inconsistency in the terminology used, which can lead to confusion. Of these, there were actually 6 where the ERG also described the approach incorrectly. And just 4 of the submissions acknowledged that the clinical endpoints are independent, which is one of the key limitations of partition survival analysis. So what were the concerns raised by ERG or NICE in these submissions? The most commonly raised concerns were related to the maturity of the data and the uncertainty around the long-term projections. There was also lack of evidence to support a post-progression treatment benefit. So because the post-progression mortality transition isn't modelled directly in the partition survival approach, it's not possible to establish from the model whether this effect was supported by the trial data in any way, or if it's generated entirely during the extrapolation. So one way to address this would be to look at within-trial post-progression survival curves. This could be used to support the assessment of the extrapolation if this was available. Also, they said that modelled survival results were likely to be biased by the application of hazard ratios from indirect comparisons or by external data that were used. So a possible way to overcome this would be to take into account longer-term trials or observational data for validation purposes. So also then thinking about what the situation may be for the SMC in Scotland. So we did some research ourselves. We looked at the 22 submissions that the DSU document had identified, which used a partition survival analysis for NICE. And then we looked to see whether they had also submitted to the SMC, and 20 of them had. Of these, 3 of them used a cost minimization approach, and this is a requirement by the SMC. If there's no statistically significant differences in efficacy between treatments, they usually recommend to use a cost minimization. And then for the remainder, it was quite difficult to tell whether a partition survival analysis had actually been used, and this was due to 2 reasons. One was that the SMC published less information than NICE about the approach taken and the assumptions. And the second point is that there was such inconsistency in the terminology used to describe the modelling approaches. So even though they described it as a Markov model, it's likely that they just used the same model that they did for NICE and that it was in fact a partition survival analysis. So 6 of them did state it, that it was a partition survival analysis, but it's very likely that the remaining 11 also used the partition survival. So the common critiques were similar to those from NICE in terms of the uncertainty in the long-term extrapolation, concerns about OS, PFS, and indirect treatment comparison data, and also issues with the methods to account for treatment switching. In some submissions, there were comparisons made against the results predicted by the model, and they compared this to the trial results or other registry data. But as far as we could see, there were no specific concerns related to the choice of partition survival analysis as an approach, and therefore it seems that SMC review it in a similar way to NICE do. So now moving on to the critique, which was reported by the Decision Support Unit document. So I'm going to go through some of the strengths and limitations of partition survival analysis now. So the first is that you can directly use OS and PFS data from your clinical trials. And this is obviously intuitive, easy to communicate, and also easy to construct. It's straightforward to reflect time dependencies in event rates. So because you're using the OS and PFS data directly, you account for the time dependency without having to include tunnel states as you would in a Markov model. It provides accurate predictions for overall survival for the within trial period because you're using the data directly again. You can implement it using individual patient data, but if this isn't available, you can use summary data as well. So this is important if you don't have access to the patient level data, but also if you wanted to include comparators for which you don't have data, you can obtain summary data for that and still use a partition survival analysis model. Indirect treatment comparison data can easily be incorporated, and you would do this by applying hazard ratios to the overall survival and progression-free survival curves. Another strength is that there are recommended methods for adjusting for treatment switching which can be applied. So on the other hand, then, to summarise the limitations, the key one is that the survival functions are independent, but in reality there may be dependencies which are not captured in the extrapolation period. The uncertainty in the long-term extrapolations and difficulty to assess the plausibility of the extrapolations. Another thing that can result from this is that you can have a progression-free survival curve which lies above the overall survival curve, and then you would need to make an adjustment. And in one of the cases in the technology appraisals to NICE, the method that was used for this was criticised, so it's something to be aware of. And the last limitation is that it's difficult to reflect correlation between survival curves in probabilistic sensitivity analysis. So when you do sensitivity analysis, you want to vary your inputs simultaneously, and the OS and PFS are assumed to be independent, so it can be more difficult to try and account for the correlation between the two. So something else that the DSU also mention is an alternative approach to both partition survival analysis and Markov models, which is a multi-state Markov model. It fits the same structure as the standard three-state health state model, which we've already discussed, with progression-free, progressive disease and death. However, survival regression models are created for each transition directly using the individual patient data. And it uses the exact time of transition, so this means that it's a continuous time framework rather than a discrete time framework. And because of this, it's usually built in statistical packages such as R. The recommendation from the DSU is that state transition models should use established multi-state modelling techniques to estimate transition probabilities where possible. However, there is at the moment little guidance available to inform survival model selection in this multi-state setting, especially in the context of cost-effectiveness analysis, where the extrapolation is key. So there's a published paper as well which compared multi-state Markov model approaches to both partition survival and Markov. They did a case study where they looked at Roche's three-state Markov model for rituximab in leukemia from a NICE technology appraisal. And the authors replicated the economic evaluation as both a partition survival analysis and a multi-state Markov model, and then they compared the three approaches. They found that the partition survival analysis and the Markov model resulted in ICEs of just over 16,000 and 13,000 respectively, whereas the multi-state model gave an ICE of just over 29,000. However, they concluded that the actual approach used had less of an effect on the results than the differing assumptions made within each approach. But what they summarise is that it's important to ensure that your modelling assumptions are realistic before you start, and they recommend that analysts liaise with clinicians and use registry data and/or external sources to help gather evidence to ensure that your assumptions are realistic. So I think this is something that is regularly done at a later stage, but if you can engage with clinicians and use external data early on in order to inform your model choice, then this can be really beneficial. So the DSU document ends with some recommendations, and if you go to the report you can see their full list of recommendations, but I've just pulled out some of the key ones here which are specifically related to partition survival analysis. So the first one is that the model conceptualization process should be reported and the rationale for the chosen modelling approach should be explicitly justified. Secondly, relating to the consistency in terminology, we saw from the NICE technology appraisal that only a small proportion of the submissions actually called their approach partition survival analysis. So a recommendation is to use consistent and appropriate terminology, and they recommend using partition survival analysis going forward. A summary of the main structural assumptions should be reported and justified, and all stakeholders should recognise the limitations of partition survival analysis in terms of extrapolation. And then when you do require extrapolation, the partition survival model should easily facilitate the investigation of alternative assumptions. So although you will need to select a base case in most situations, it's common practice in your model to include lots of different options. So the statistical distributions, which I mentioned earlier, would often be selectable in the model so that the user can choose a different option for extrapolation and see how this affects the results. The next point is that state transition modelling, so a Markov model, should be used alongside partition survival analysis to assist in the validation. So you don't necessarily have to submit. This doesn't mean that you have to submit two models, but what you can do is in the background have a Markov model approach so that you can see what the effects of using that approach would be, and if you get questions later down the line, you will be able to say that we also explored using a Markov model approach and these are the impacts. Presentation of results should include tabulated life year and QALY differences, and you should justify why these differences are plausible. And lastly, they have one of their recommendations for future research is that more research is needed to support appropriate specification of state transition models using multi-state survival analysis. So this is an approach which hasn't been commonly used to date, but does require more research in the future. So now to summarise, so the key difference between partition survival analysis and Markov models is the way in which the state membership is derived. So partition survival analysis uses survival curves directly, whereas Markov models use transition probabilities. Partition survival analysis is the most commonly used modelling approach in NICETAS for interventions treating advanced or metastatic cancers. The main benefit is that you can directly use your OS and PFS data from clinical trials, and this allows for time dependencies to be easily incorporated. However, the main drawbacks of partition survival analysis are that the survival curves are assumed to be independent, and this leads to uncertainty being associated with the extrapolation. So your main alternative to a partition survival analysis is a Markov model, but in order to consider changes in risk over time, then the recommendation is that a multi-state Markov model should be used. So at the moment, these haven't been used widely in health economic evaluations, but this is something that could potentially become more common in the future. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Hannah. We haven't had any questions submitted yet. If anybody would like to ask a question, then please do use the questions facility on your screen. In the meantime, I will just say that the recording of today's presentation will automatically go out to every attendee, so you can listen again if you want to. Alternatively, if you want to discuss anything that we presented today in more detail, then obviously you can get in touch with us directly. Don't appear to be any questions, so I will thank everybody for joining. And I will end the presentation now. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.